sich nur als Imposant.
Hi everyone, welcome to WION Live broadcast from New York City. I'm Susan Tehrani, your host. First, let's take a look at this hour's headlines. Russian President Vladimir Putin invites Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi to Moscow. This comes on the brink of Prime Minister Modi's telephone conversation with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, and an underscoring that India supports all efforts for an early and peaceful resolution of all issues between Russia and Ukraine. Israel's military claims it killed 90 gunmen and arrested 160 in a raid on Gaza's Al-Shifa hospital. Hamas rejects the claim. Israel says it has uncovered a network of tunnels under the hospital, saying they were used by Hamas as command and control centers. Pressure mounts on former U.S. President Donald Trump to pay $454 million he owes to the state in a civil fraud lawsuit. Reports say Trump may be forced to mortgage or sell parts of his real estate business at fire sale prices if he can't meet the Monday deadline. An appeals court in the U.S. has again blocked a Republican-backed Texas law that would have allowed arrests of people suspected of illegally crossing the U.S.-Mexico border in the country. The reversal comes hours after the U.S. Supreme Court cleared the way for the new law. South Korean and U.S. militaries conduct joint drills titled the Joint Wet Gap Crossing Exercise just below South Korea's border with North Korea. Air and land defense assets deployed with bridges built to cross a river in the area. Intel is planning a $100 billion spending spree across 4 U.S. states to build and expand factories after securing $19.5 billion in federal grants and loans. And it hopes to secure another $25 billion in tax breaks. Russia slams the International Olympic Committee's decision to bar Russian and Belarusian athletes from Paris Olympics opening ceremony. The Russian Foreign Ministry calls the move unjust and unacceptable. All right, we have some breaking news for you. Hours after a telephone conversation between Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi and Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, Russian President Vladimir Putin has extended a formal invitation to Prime Minister Modi to visit Moscow. In his telephone talks with the Ukrainian president, the Indian Prime Minister reiterated India's people-centric approach and called for dialogue and diplomacy as the way forward to ending the Russia-Ukraine conflict. Modi highlighted that India supports all efforts for an early and peaceful resolution of all issues between the parties. He added that India would continue to do everything within its means to support a peaceful solution. Amid extensive Ukraine-India engagement in recent weeks, the Ukrainian foreign minister is due to travel to India in the last week of March. All eyes will be on the schedule and developments around the Indian prime minister's visit to Kremlin at the invitation of President Vladimir Putin. All right, for more details, we're now being joined by our principal diplomatic correspondent, Siddhan Sabal. Siddhan, great to see you. This is really a developing story and breaking news. What do we know more about this invitation and what are its implications?
Well, two things. First, the Indian Prime Minister spoke to both the Russian president and the Ukrainian president earlier today. I'll get back into what were the contents of the conversation. But coming to the second point, both of them have invited the Indian Prime Minister for a post-election visit. Now, this is interesting. That shows the optimism both the leaders share of an anticipated third term for the Indian Prime Minister. Now, we know that India goes to elections in the month of April. It will be a 2-month-long process. And in this process, we will see, of course, India going to polls, which will be a mammoth exercise. Crores of people will be voting, and the results will be due on 4th of June. But essentially, the fact that the invitation has been extended to the Prime Minister to visit their country is an expression of optimism both Moscow and Kyiv share. Of course, they don't share many things. But now coming to the contents of the conversation, when the conversation happened, the big focus remained on the Russia-Ukraine conflict. Now, India is seen as a peacemaker in many words. We know that the Indian Prime Minister, when he met with the Russian president, he mentioned dialogue and diplomacy, and this is something that has been the buzzword since then for the Indian policymakers. India, of course, also said, the Indian Prime Minister said that this is not an era of war, which basically shows that how essentially that this conflict needs to be resolved. It has a major impact on the global south as well. So all in all, if we look at how the conversations have been going between India and Russia, while India has been importing energy from Russia, it of course has also been highlighting that this conflict is damaging to the global south as well, being the voice of the global south. Now, when it comes to Ukraine, now there have been multiple engagements between India and Ukraine in the past 1 month. We saw the Deputy Foreign Minister of Ukraine visiting India. She spoke to WION exclusively that time. Now, this month we have seen the NSA, the Indian NSA and his counterpart speaking, the Indian Prime Minister and the Ukrainian President speaking, and next week the Ukrainian Foreign Minister will be traveling to India. Why so much conversation? The big focus remains on the peace summit that happened in Switzerland, and we know that the big focus is that will India attend, and that is what the Ukrainian side wants. So all in all, a very big day in diplomacy in terms of the conversations and where these conversations go in terms of the bilateral aspect of the relationship.
All right, great. Siddhan, thank you so much for all of those updates. We'll be watching this story, of course, very closely, and I'll talk to you very soon. Former President Donald Trump must secure a bond for a whopping $454 million in the New York civil fraud case judgment. But his legal team says the amount is excessive. They are urging the court to delay the enforcement of the judgment. But will the courts listen to Donald Trump? Can he avert the authorities from seizing up his most prized asset, his real estate? Our next report tells you more.
Donald J. Trump, former US president and billionaire real estate mogul. With business spanning an empire of skyscrapers, hotels, casinos, and golf courses. But ever since Trump's tenure ended at the White House, he is caught up in unending legal battles. Or as he says, fighting a political witch hunt. However he chooses to describe them, Trump's legal cases are costing him money, at least $500,000 in penalties. An amount that grows by $112,000 per day. The New York civil fraud case judgment is the biggest challenge to his personal wealth. For now, he has until March end to come up with the funds, or face seizure of his assets.
The New York Attorney General's office won a $450 million judgment against Trump. and they can immediately start enforcing that judgment. By enforcing that judgment, I mean sending out the marshal or the sheriff to seize assets. Attorney General's office has said that they would give him a 30-day grace period, but there's no requirement to give that grace. And anyway, those 30 days are coming up next week.
Trump's lawyers claim the former US president is unable to get a bond of $454 million. Despite negotiating with 30 underwriters, the lawyers urged the court to delay enforcement of the judgment, while claiming Trump can post a $100 million bond, arguing that a lending ban in the February 16 verdict is making it impossible for Trump to secure a bond for the full amount. That does not leave Trump with too many options except putting up the entire amount in cash.
This was a rigged trial by a crooked judge and a crooked attorney general, and we're fighting it out with them. We have a lot of cash and we have a great company, but they want to take it away, or at least take the cash element away. Billions of dollars in value, billions of dollars in properties, but they'd like to take the cash away so I can't use it on the campaign. And this is just a corrupt group of people.
On the other hand, Trump can secure a bond that would guarantee the payment if he were to lose his appeal. Although, the fees charged by the company could also prove costly for him. So Trump must either find the cash or post a bond. Else, be forced to sell priced real estate properties in a fire sale. The $454 million judgment is not Trump's only legal penalty. In a separate case in January, Donald Trump was ordered to pay $83 million after losing a defamation case to E. Jean Carroll, a woman he had allegedly abused sexually. Bureau Report, WION World is One.
Okay, well, for more on all of this, we are being joined by Nick Ackerman from New York. Nick is a former Watergate prosecutor and assistant U.S. attorney. He's a lawyer, and he is joining us from New York. Thank you so much for joining us on WION. Is there any way former President Donald Trump can prevent the authorities from seizing his assets to satisfy this judgment? Or do you think he'll be forced to surrender control of his properties to meet these massive bond requirements?
Well, the only way he's going to prevent it is if he gets the entire appeals court to let him have some kind of leeway here, either in terms of a lesser bond or more time. More time isn't going to help him. Normally, anybody who has a judgment against them does not get a lesser bond. So I think unless he comes up with cash between now and next week, $500,000 in cash, the Attorney General is going to start proceedings against his properties, his bank accounts. It's a pretty simple procedure. It's a matter of putting restraining notices on bank accounts and on properties, although there are some probably a lot to be done with the properties since they're probably in LLCs, which means normally, under those circumstances, someone trying to execute a judgment on an LLC is only entitled to the proceeds that the individual's interests accrue in that LLC. However, there is an exception if they can pierce the corporate veil, that is to show that Donald Trump really controls those LLCs for each of these properties, and that he has set it up as a way to prevent his properties from being seized. So more to be seen on this next week, but I think he's looking at having these seizures go forward at this point.
And what does this mean politically moving forward for the former president, but also for Letitia James as well? We see videos and constant reminder that she really campaigned on, quote unquote, getting Donald Trump.
Well, I don't think she campaigned on getting Donald Trump. She campaigned on basically bringing him to justice wherever she can. It was part of a joint investigation with the Manhattan District Attorney's Office, which resulted in the indictment that's going to be going to trial sometime in the next month. It also resulted in this fraud case. So there was nothing about getting him. He's been a fraudster for a long period of time. It started back in the early 90s when he filed bankruptcy in his casinos in New Jersey, and started in the early 90s in terms of not only the bankruptcies, but in order to get cash, he set up a tax scam, basically evading taxes by arranging for his father's money to be distributed to him and his siblings so they wouldn't have to pay gift tax. And then when he couldn't get money through legitimate means, which he couldn't after those bankruptcies, he wound up borrowing money from the Russians and set up a property such as Trump Soho that was, in effect, a fraud on the purchasers of those properties and would have resulted in an indictment but for the fact that he provided a $30,000 campaign contribution to the DA at the time. And since then, he's had to actually get money from legitimate banks because the Russian money dried up. And so that led him to falsify his financial statements, which is where we are today with this massive judgment. So in some ways, nobody got Donald Trump except Donald Trump.
Okay, well, Mr. Nick Ackerman, thank you so much for that thorough analysis, and we'll be watching this story very closely. I look forward to speaking to you again very soon. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye-bye.
The race for the White House is heating up. America is all set to witness a rerun of 2020, a rematch between Joe Biden and Donald Trump. Incumbent President Joe Biden has now called in his most reliable wild card. According to reports, Biden is listing his predecessor, no other than Barack Obama, and former House Speaker Nancy Pelosi to bolster his case to voters. They will be pushing the pitch that Biden has made healthcare more affordable and that he deserves another term in the White House. On Saturday, Biden, Obama, and Pelosi will rally virtually with activists. The event will mark the 14th anniversary of the signing of the Affordable Care Act, also known as Obamacare. According to Biden's advisors, this is part of a broader push by Biden to make this one of the strongest arguments for his reelection. The incumbent president has for long signaled that his plans to showcase the positive of his healthcare push, his plan to go after his presumptive opponent, Donald Trump, who suggests Republicans should take another run at repealing Obamacare. Okay, hours after U.S. Supreme Court had allowed the strict new immigration law to take effect, a federal appeals court late on Tuesday issued an order that again prevents Texas from arresting migrants suspected of entering the U.S. legally. Our next report gets you the details.
Texas law enforcement can no longer arrest people suspected of illegally crossing the U.S.-Mexico border again, just hours after the country's top court said that for now they could. The legal whiplash came from an appeals court who halted the enforcement of the Republican-backed state law ahead of oral arguments on the issue scheduled for Wednesday morning. Earlier on Tuesday, the U.S. Supreme Court had cleared the way for it to go into effect before the appeals court decides on its legality, ruling 6-3 along the justices' ideological lines. The judicial back and forth began last December, shortly after Republican Texas Governor Greg Abbott signed the contentious measure to criminalize unauthorized border crossings into law.
I have used a clause in the Constitution that empowers states to defend themselves.
Abbott has said the state law is needed due to President Joe Biden's failure to enforce federal laws to criminalize illegal entry or re-entry, leaving Texas to, quote, fend for itself. The state law's penalties threaten offenders with up to 20 years in prison. The Biden administration sued in January to block the measure, arguing that it violates the U.S. Constitution and federal law by interfering with the U.S. government's power to regulate immigration. And various courts have paused and unpaused its enforcement as the case has traveled through layers of the legal system. Biden's approach to the record numbers of migrants crossing the U.S.-Mexico border has drawn sharp criticism from Republicans. However, in February, it was Republicans who scuttled a bipartisan Senate deal that would have bolstered border security and tightened immigration laws after Donald Trump pushed members of his party to reject it. Biden said blame for the bill's failure lay with the pressure from Trump, who, quote, thinks it's bad for him politically.